Okay, we are finally going to start using Framer X. And we're going to build our first code component. So I've created a brand new Framer file here. Let me just save it. I start out in the Framer canvas, but I'm not going to do anything in the canvas yet. I'm going to switch over to the code panel, and I'm going to click New at the top here to create a new code component. Framer wants me to name it when I create it. So I want to create a component that is like a little palette that you can drag around on the screen. So I'm going to call my component palette. And when I create a new component, Framer creates this file for me, and it even populates it with a bunch of boilerplate code. That's very nice of Framer, but I'm actually going to delete all this so that we can start from scratch and look at everything piece by piece as we build it. So the first thing we need to do in every code component file that we make is to import the code libraries for React and for Framer. So Framer already copies both of those libraries into our project file. So we're not actually adding anything to our project when we do this. We just need to let the code that's going to be in this file know that we want to use those two libraries. So the import for React looks like this. So I'm importing from the library called React, and the star means I want to import everything from this library. And when I use it into my code, I'm going to refer to it by the name React with a capital R. We're not going to do anything explicitly with the React library yet, but we still need to import this so that our code component will work because our code component is a React component. Next, we need to import the Framer library like this. Now, the way we do these two imports is a little different, isn't it? The React one is saying, I want to have access to everything in this library. And the Framer one is saying, I just want to use this one frame element from the Framer library. So both of these have a bunch of stuff in them. For React, I want to be able to use all of that stuff. And for Framer, I just want to use this one element called frame. So now we've got our two libraries imported, and we can create our code component. So React components and Framer code components are just JavaScript functions. So we already learned how to create a JavaScript function, so I can create one like this using the function keyword. I'll name my function with the name I want to use for my component, which is palette in this case. And the convention in React is to capitalize the component names. So this is just a function. To make it into a component, we need to make this function return some React code. So this should look familiar to us, even if we've never written React before. It looks a lot like HTML, doesn't it? We have a tag here called frame. It has a companion closing tag, and those two tags wrap some text, just like HTML. This is in fact not HTML though. This is called JSX. It's a type of markup that looks a lot like HTML. It can even contain HTML sometimes, but it's more powerful than HTML because we can use it with our own custom tags. So for example, frame is not an HTML tag. It's a custom tag that comes from the Framer library. And a frame tag is sort of the base level element in Framer. You can think of it sort of like a generic layer or a container. And this is all we need to create a Framer component. We imported the libraries for React and Framer. We created a function with the component name that returns some JSX code. But if I switch over to my Components tab, my component should show up here in this list, but I don't see anything there. That's because there's one more thing we have to add to our component to make this work. We need to export our component. So just like we need to import code from other files if we want to use it here, we need to export the code from this file if we want it to be visible outside of this file. So if we want it to be visible in the Components tab, we need to export it from this file. So now when I switch back to the Components tab, I see my beautiful component right here, and I can drag it out onto the canvas and see this nice blue box that says Hello World inside. And it looks like this because this is the default styling for that frame element. Of course, we can change that styling to make it look however we want. First, I'm just going to put our component inside a phone size frame on the canvas so we can see it better. And then I'll pop open the preview window and lock it to this frame so we can see how our component is looking as we work on it in the code. So let's switch back over to the code panel, and I'll change the background color of this frame from the default light blue to white. I do that by setting the background color property to a string that represents the color I want. This string can be any type of CSS color. So I used a hex color for white, but I could also just type white, or I could enter an RGB or an RGBA value there. I'm also going to change the size of the frame by setting the width and the height, and I want it to have rounded corners, so I'll set the border radius property as well. Now let's pause for a second and look at a couple of things. First, how do I know what property names to use for these? Well, there are two ways you can figure that out. First, if you already know some CSS, you'll find that all of the visual properties for a frame correspond to CSS properties. The only difference is that for properties that would normally have a dash in the name in CSS, we use camel case in JSX. So border dash radius gets changed to border radius with a capital R. Background dash color gets changed to background color with a capital C. The second way you can find out what's available if you don't know CSS is by going to the documentation for Frame on the Framer website. You might want to bookmark this page because you'll be using it a lot, but if you look on the left side here, there are sections for layout and visual properties, and that's where you can find all the property names that are available for you to customize. One other thing to look at here before we move on is these curly braces. In HTML, we would typically wrap our property values in quotes, like I did here, but in JSX, which is what this is, we always wrap property values in curly braces. Well, we always do it unless the property value is a string. In that case, we just use quotes. I can't really explain why that is. It's just something you'll have to remember and learn through practice. Okay, so let's move on. I want to add a title bar to my palette, and I can do that by adding another frame element to this component. And since the title bar is a part of the palette, I want it to be contained by this other frame. So the title bar frame will get wrapped by this container frame. Now, since my title bar is inside this other frame, that means its positioning coordinates are now relative to its parent frame instead of being relative to the overall phone screen. And that means as this palette, this white container, gets moved around the screen, the title bar will move with it without me constantly needing to update its position on the frame itself. And we can see that in practice if I just enable dragging on this parent frame. I do that by setting the drag property to true. Now I can drag around this white box, which is the outer frame, and the title bar frame moves around with it. And if I start to get confused in my code about what these two frames are for, I can give them both names. That doesn't have any effect on my component. It's just for me to be able to see more easily what these frames represent. Now, it might be hard to see on the video, but the corners of this title bar, this blue title bar, are actually extending outside of the white container frame. To fix that, I could set the border radius of this title bar as well to match the border radius of the container frame. But there's an easier way to do it. I can just set the overflow property of the container frame to hidden. And that means that any elements contained within this frame that extend beyond the bounds of that frame will get clipped. So technically, my title bar frame is still having those corners extend beyond the container, but they're just not being shown anymore because I've chosen overflow hidden. Now I just want to add one more frame so that we can have a close button on this palette. So I'm going to make a new frame with background color white. And if my width and height are going to be the same, I can use this shortcut and just set the size property to be 28. Instead of having to set width and height separately, setting the size will set both of those for me. And I want this to be a circle, so I can just set the border radius to be 50%. And I'm just going to add a gray border around the button so that it will stand out a little bit more. Now, pay attention to the order of my frame for my close button and the frame for the title bar. This view for my component gets built up by stacking these frames on top of each other in the order in which they appear in this JSX code. And remember, my code always runs from the top down. So if I want my close button to be on top of the title bar, which I do, I need to place its frame after the title bar frame in my JSX. If I put it before the title bar, then my close button is actually appearing behind the title bar, which is not what I want. So I need it to come after that element. But actually, it might be better to put the close button inside of my title bar instead of stacking it on top. Because at least in my mind, the close button sort of conceptually belongs to the title bar. So it makes sense to group them together. And it also makes it easier to position the close button because then its position will be relative to the title bar instead of relative to this entire palette. So to illustrate that, I can use a property that frame has called center. And if I set center to true, it will center my button inside its parent element, which is currently this entire palette. So it puts the button right in the middle of that. But if I move my button to be inside of my title bar element, then it will center inside of the title bar. That's not exactly what I want either. I want my button to be over in this corner. So instead of setting center to be true, I can set it to center on only one axis by specifying either X or Y. I want mine to center vertically in the title bar, so I'm going to set the center property to Y. So we can see now it's centered vertically in the title bar, and I'm going to scoot it over a little bit by setting the property called left to set the distance from the left. And then I'll add a little X character as the content for this close button frame. So there we go. That's pretty good for our first code component. Now I can just drag this into my project wherever I need to have a little palette. And I could even add a bunch of them to this screen if I want to have a bunch of them. But now when they start stacking on top of each other, it's hard to differentiate them. They sort of all blur together. So I'm going to go back into my code component and add a shadow to the main container frame. And now every instance of my component on the screen automatically gets that drop shadow that I just added, which is cool. But we could do that same thing with a design component, and it would probably be easier and faster than us building this code component. But our code component can also have behavior associated with it. So in this case, we only enabled dragging, but we could have built in more functionality, like maybe being able to resize this palette or to be able to click the close button to actually close it. If you want to add functionality like that to a design component, you'd need to wire up each instance of the component to an override. But we get our functionality included with the component just by dragging it out onto the canvas. So any one of these I can now drag around without needing overrides because the behavior is included in the code component. So that's it for our first basic code component. We're going to be getting a lot more advanced with code components as we go. So as we move forward, just remember that a Framer code component is just a JavaScript function that returns JSX code.